hidden beneath the vast canopy is a lost world of the ancient Maya. Whole towns and cities vanished.
I mentioned them briefly. I explored the Olmec mystery. It's considered to be the earliest high culture of Central America.
In 2015, a geneticist stared at her screen and froze. The data made no sense. Indigenous people in the Amazon carried DNA from the opposite side of the world.
This is a day in the life of the indigenous Sapara people, who live deep within the Ecuadorian Amazon.
Aboriginal Australians, centuries of history, suddenly rewritten in a single genetic signature. And that was just the beginning. Because as scientists dug deeper, they found entire civilizations erased from the genetic record, vanished as if someone had deleted them from history. And at the center of this mystery stood the Aztecs, an empire built not just on conquest, but on the ashes of those who came before. What really happened in the Americas? And who decided which stories would survive? Aztec genetic secrets. For decades, the history of the Americas seemed settled, simple, almost boring in its straightforwardness. Every textbook told the same story. Every documentary repeated the same narrative. Roughly 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels dropped low enough to expose a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. Small bands of hunters followed game across this frozen corridor and found themselves on a new continent. From there, generation after generation moved south. Hunters became farmers, camps became villages, villages became cities. Everything followed a logical progression. No mysteries, no complications, just humans doing what humans do, adapting and spreading across new territory. The model was clean, it was elegant, it explained how people reached every corner of two continents without requiring anything unusual. One migration, one source population, one clear path from Asia to the Americas. Scientists built careers on this foundation. Museums designed exhibits around it. Students memorized it for exams. The question of how the Americas were populated seemed answered. Within this framework, the Aztecs made perfect sense. They were late arrivals, showing up in the Valley of Mexico around 1325 AD, founding their capital Tenochtitlan on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco.
The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, fell to Spanish conquerors. The Aztec tribute took place in Zocalo Square, located in the Mexican capital.
Compared to ancient civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia, they were practically modern. Newcomers who built on the foundations left by earlier Mesoamerican cultures. Nothing mysterious about them. Just another group of people who migrated, settled, and built something impressive. And what they built was extraordinary. In less than 200 years, the Aztecs created one of the largest cities on Earth at that time. Tenochtitlan had a population larger than London or Paris. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it rising from the lake, they thought they were hallucinating. They had never seen anything like it. Causeways stretched across the water connecting the island to the mainland. Aqueducts carried fresh water for miles. Floating gardens called chinampas turned shallow waters into productive farmland, feeding hundreds of thousands of people. Massive pyramids dominated the skyline. Markets bustled with goods from across the known world. The Aztecs tracked celestial movements with precision that rivaled anything in Europe. They developed complex calendars that interlocked cycles of days, months, and years. They created sophisticated legal systems, elaborate religious hierarchies, and an empire that dominated central Mexico through a combination of military force and political cunning. Their administration managed tribute and communication across hundreds of kilometers, linking diverse peoples and regions into a cohesive whole. Historians explained this rapid rise through inheritance. The Aztecs, they said, stood on the shoulders of giants. They absorbed knowledge from the Olmec, the Maya, the Toltec, and the mysterious builders of Teotihuacan.
Transition between Olmec and Maya civilizations. Tacalicabaj is one such Olmec site in western Guatemala.
What looked like sudden advancement was really the accumulation of centuries of shared ideas passed down through generations. The Aztecs were good students. They learned from their predecessors, improved upon what they inherited, and built something greater than what came before. It was a reasonable explanation. It fit the evidence available at the time. It required no leaps of logic, no mysterious interventions, no unexplained phenomena. Just human ingenuity building on human ingenuity across generations. And it was wrong, because underneath the reasonable explanation, questions persisted. Questions that historians acknowledged, but could never quite answer. How did such complex organization appear so quickly? The Aztec state operated with a precision that seemed to require centuries of development, not decades. Their marketplaces functioned with the efficiency of modern trading systems. Prices were regulated, goods were standardized, disputes were settled through established procedures. Their bureaucracy managed tribute from dozens of conquered peoples, tracking what was owed, what was paid, and what was overdue. Their military expanded the empire while maintaining cohesion across diverse peoples and territories who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. None of this emerged from nothing. But if the Aztecs inherited so much from earlier civilizations, what happened to those civilizations? Where did they go? The Olmec vanished. The great Maya cities were abandoned. Teotihuacan burned and emptied. The Toltec collapsed into legend. Each of these predecessors left behind pyramids, temples, artwork, and ruins. But they seemed to leave behind no people, no descendants carrying on their traditions, no populations maintaining their cultures. The Aztecs inherited empty cities and silent monuments. They inherited knowledge without teachers. They inherited systems without the people who created them. For generations, this paradox sat unexamined. Scholars assumed that populations simply blended together over time, that the descendants of earlier civilizations were absorbed into later ones, that cultural continuity masked biological continuity. It seemed logical. It seemed obvious. It required no investigation. The answers were locked in a place no one thought to look. Not in ruins or codices or Spanish colonial records. The answers were written in the DNA of the people themselves. And when scientists finally learned to read that genetic code, the story of the Aztecs transformed from a tale of inheritance into something far stranger, a story of ghosts, of vanished fathers, and of an empire built on the bones of the erased. The vanishing fathers not diminished, not reduced, missing. The Y chromosome lineages of the Olmec, the builders of Teotihuacan, the early Maya, the Toltec, all of them had largely vanished from the genetic record.
Before the Aztecs and before the Maya, there were a culture who are referred to as the Olmecs.
The male lines that should have connected these civilizations to their descendants had been broken, erased, replaced by something else. This was not a gradual process. The breaks in male lineages coincided with moments of crisis. The collapse of Teotihuacan around 550 AD shows one of the starkest examples. Right before the city fell, almost the entire male genetic profile of the population changed. The men who had built one of the greatest cities in the Americas were replaced by men from somewhere else. Women's lineages told a different story. Maternal DNA persisted through these upheavals. Women were absorbed into new populations, married into new communities, and carried their genetic heritage forward. But the men, the fathers, the leaders, the warriors, they disappeared. This pattern repeated across Mesoamerican history. Civilization after civilization rose, flourished, and then experienced a genetic rupture that eliminated most male lineages while female lines continued. It was as if someone had been systematically removing men from the population while preserving women. By the time the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they were not entering virgin territory. They were stepping into a graveyard, a land filled with the descendants of women whose fathers, grandfathers, and male ancestors had been erased from existence. a land waiting for new men to fill the gaps. To understand what the Aztecs inherited, you have to understand what was taken from the people who came before them. Y chromosome analysis of ancient Mesoamerican remains has revealed a pattern so consistent it cannot be coincidence. At moments of civilizational collapse, male lineages were replaced, not slowly over generations, suddenly, sometimes within a single generation. Teotihuacan provides the clearest example. At its peak, the city housed over 100,000 people.
Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with over 150,000 inhabitants at its peak.
It was one of the largest urban centers in the world, rivaling Rome in population. Its influence extended across Mesoamerica. Its architectural style, religious symbols, and trade goods appear in sites hundreds of kilometers away. For centuries, it dominated the region. Then it fell. Around 550 AD, the city experienced catastrophic violence. Temples were burned, monuments were destroyed, and the genetic composition of the population changed almost overnight. The Y chromosomes that had been dominant in the city for generations largely disappeared, replaced by lineages from outside the region. The women remained. Their mitochondrial DNA shows continuity across the collapse. They survived, were absorbed into whatever new order emerged, and passed their maternal ancestry to future generations. But their husbands, their fathers, their sons had been replaced. This pattern appears again and again. The Olmec heartland shows similar genetic disruptions. Maya sites reveal breaks in male lineages coinciding with the mysterious collapse of the classic Maya civilization. Toltec genetic signatures largely vanish after the fall of their empire. What could cause such systematic elimination of male lines while preserving female lines? War is the obvious answer. In ancient warfare, men were typically killed while women were taken as captives, concubines, or wives. A conquering army might eliminate all the adult males of a defeated population while absorbing the women into their own society. Over time, this would erase the Y chromosomes of the conquered while maintaining their mitochondrial DNA. But the scale of what happened in Mesoamerica suggests something more than ordinary warfare. These were not isolated incidents. They were recurring patterns that shaped the genetic landscape of an entire region over thousands of years. Each collapse created a vacuum. Each vacuum was filled by newcomers whose male lineages then dominated until the next collapse. By the time the Aztecs arrived, the Valley of Mexico had been through multiple cycles of this process. The men who should have been there, the genetic heirs of the great civilizations, were gone. Their daughters and granddaughters remained, but their sons had been replaced again and again. The Aztecs stepped into this void with something most recent arrivals to the region did not have: intact male lineages, unbroken chains of Y chromosomes stretching back to wherever they originally came from. They were not survivors of collapse. They were fresh blood in a land of broken bloodlines. The Aztecs, Empire of Blood. The timing of the Aztec arrival in the Valley of Mexico looks almost too perfect to be accidental. According to their own histories, the Mexica, as the Aztecs called themselves, wandered for generations before finding their home. They claim to have originated from a mythical place called Aztlan and to have been guided by their god Huitzilopochtli to seek a specific sign, an eagle perched on a cactus eating a snake. They found this sign on an island in Lake Texcoco in 1325, founded Tenochtitlan, and began their rise to power. Historians have long debated how much of this origin story is historical and how much is mythological. But DNA adds a new dimension to the question. The Aztecs arrived in a region that had been genetically destabilized by centuries of violence and collapse. The male lineages of earlier civilizations had been largely erased. The surviving populations were genetically fragmented, their paternal ancestry broken and replaced multiple times. Into this fractured landscape came the Aztecs, with their intact Y chromosomes.
20 years ago, researchers completed the first human genome sequence. However, the Y chromosomes sequence remained a mystery.
Their male lines had not been shattered by conquest. They had not been absorbed into other populations and diluted over time. They arrived as a coherent group with strong paternal ancestry, ready to establish dominance. DNA shows exactly this pattern. As the Aztecs expanded, their male lineages spread across central Mexico. They married women from conquered populations, blending their Y chromosomes with the maternal lineages that had survived earlier collapses. Within a few generations, Aztec paternal ancestry became dominant across their growing empire. This was not just political conquest, it was genetic conquest. The Aztecs were filling vacuums that had been created by the destruction of earlier male populations. They were becoming the fathers of regions whose original fathers had been erased. Studies of city-states that came under Aztec control show dramatic shifts in maternal lineages following conquest. Families were displaced. Local gene pools were reorganized. Women from conquered regions appear in genetic samples from the Aztec heartland, suggesting large-scale movement of female populations into the center of the empire. The efficiency of this process suggests deliberate strategy as much as accidental opportunity. The Aztecs understood the power of integration. Their tributary system did not simply demand goods and labor from conquered peoples. It absorbed them. Local elites were often allowed to maintain positions of authority in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Intermarriage between Aztec nobility and local ruling families created bonds of blood as well as politics. Through conquest, marriage, and the systematic integration of conquered populations, the Aztecs reshaped the genetic landscape of Mesoamerica. They did not merely build an empire of territories and cities. They built an empire of bloodlines, extending their paternal ancestry across a region whose previous fathers had been deleted from history. The Aztecs conquered with more than armies. They conquered with words. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, became one of the most powerful tools of imperial integration. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were astonished to discover how widely Nahuatl was already understood. Traders spoke it, messengers carried it. Marketplaces from the deserts of northern Mexico to the jungles of Central America echoed with it. This linguistic spread was not accidental. Language travels with people. Wherever Nahuatl went, speakers of Nahuatl went. Merchants, soldiers, administrators, craftsmen, priests. Each group carried their genetic heritage along with their vocabulary. DNA confirms what the linguistic evidence suggests. Regions connected by Nahuatl trade routes show patterns of genetic mixing consistent with long-distance movement. Maternal and paternal lineages appear in combinations that reveal travel, marriage, and integration across vast distances. The power of language as a tool of empire cannot be overstated. When conquered peoples learned Nahuatl, they gained access to markets, to administrative positions, to opportunities for advancement within the Aztec system. This created incentives for integration. Families that adopted the language and through it the culture of their conquerors were more likely to prosper. Their children were more likely to marry into Aztec lineages. Over time, conquered populations did not merely submit to Aztec rule, they became Aztec. But the linguistic and genetic evidence also points to something that predates the empire. Nahuatl words and symbols appear on artifacts far from the Aztec heartland, in regions where Aztec armies never marched. This suggests that the movement of Nahuatl speakers began long before the empire, carried by earlier groups who helped lay the foundations for the world the Aztecs would later dominate. Who were these earlier? Nahuatl speakers? Where did they come from? How did they establish the trade networks and cultural connections that the Aztecs later inherited and expanded? These questions remain partially unanswered, but they hint at a deeper history, one that extends back beyond the Aztec rise to earlier peoples whose contributions have been largely forgotten. The Aztecs did not create their empire from nothing. They inherited infrastructure, both physical and cultural, that had been building for generations, roads that had been walked before, markets that had existed before, a language that had been spreading before they arrived. They stepped into a system that was already partially constructed and completed it, leaving their genetic and linguistic signatures across an entire civilization. Written in blood. And beneath all of this, beneath the Aztecs and the civilizations they replaced, lies the oldest mystery of all. The Australasian genetic signal discovered in 2015 has forced scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about how the Americas were first populated. This DNA does not fit the standard model of Siberian migration across the Bering Land Bridge. It connects the ancient Americas to populations on the opposite side of the Pacific. The signal is old, 15,000 years or more. Far older than the Aztecs, older than the Olmec, older than any known civilization in Mesoamerica. It represents a migration or contact event that happened at the very dawn of human presence in the Americas. What makes this discovery relevant to the Aztec story is what it reveals about population dynamics across time. The Australasian signal does not appear uniformly across the Americas. It concentrated in certain regions, particularly the Amazon basin, while being nearly absent in others. This pattern suggests that populations carrying this DNA were once more widespread, but were replaced or absorbed in most regions over thousands of years. In other words, the pattern that erased earlier male lineages in Mesoamerica, the cycle of collapse and replacement, was not unique to recent history. It was a recurring process that shaped the genetic landscape of the Americas from the very beginning. Wave after wave of populations arrived, mixed, and in some cases eliminated or absorbed those who came before. The Aztecs were not the first to benefit from this process. They were simply the most recent. They inherited a continent that had been shaped by millennia of such dynamics, a land where populations were constantly being rewritten, where the genetic slate was repeatedly wiped partially clean and filled in by newcomers. This places the Aztec story in a much larger context. They were not an anomaly. They were a continuation of patterns that had been repeating since humans first reached the Americas. Their rise followed the same script that had played out countless times before, a script of arrival, conquest, genetic replacement, and eventual decline. The difference is that the Aztecs were interrupted. The Spanish arrival in 1519 ended their expansion before they could complete their consolidation. European diseases decimated their population. European weapons destroyed their military.
Pathogenicity of the virus, how likely the virus is to cause severe disease. But that's always a possibility, it could happen.
European colonization dismantled their empire, but their genetic legacy survived. Millions of people today carry Aztec ancestry, paternal and maternal lineages that spread across Mesoamerica during the brief century of Aztec dominance. The bloodlines they established during their conquest became permanent features of the population, surviving colonization, disease, and 500 years of subsequent history. The genetic revolution in archaeology has forced a fundamental reassessment of how we understand the past. For centuries, we studied history through texts, through artifacts, through ruins. These sources told us about kings and wars, about temples built and cities destroyed. But they could not tell us what happened to ordinary people. They could not reveal the movements, mixings, and erasures that shaped populations over generations. DNA can, and what it reveals is often darker and more complex than the stories we told ourselves. The Aztecs were not simply inheritors of earlier civilizations. They were conquerors who stepped into gaps created by the violent elimination of previous male populations. Their empire was built not just on military strength, but on the ashes of erased bloodlines. Their genetic dominance came not from cultural superiority, but from arriving at exactly the right moment, when the Y chromosomes of their predecessors had been shattered and vacuums waited to be filled. This does not diminish their achievements. The engineering of Tenochtitlan, the sophistication of their calendar systems, the efficiency of their administration, these accomplishments remain remarkable regardless of the genetic circumstances that enabled their rise. But it does complicate the simple narrative of a people who appeared, learned, from their neighbors, and built an empire through ambition and skill. The DNA demands that we ask harder questions. What happened to the men of Teotihuacan? Who killed them? Who replaced them? What forces drove the cycles of collapse and genetic replacement that characterized Mesoamerican history? And why did the Aztecs arrive at precisely the moment when their intact male lineages could give them maximum advantage? These questions do not have complete answers yet. DNA analysis of ancient remains is still a young field. Many sites have not been tested. Many samples await analysis. The picture will become clearer as more data accumulates. But even with incomplete information, the outlines of a new history are emerging. A history written not in temples and codices, but in the blood of the people themselves. A history of migrations that crossed oceans, of populations that rose and fell and rose again, of men who were erased and women who carried on, of newcomers who filled vacuums and established dominance until the next wave arrived. The Aztecs were one chapter in this ongoing story. They were not the beginning. They were not the end. They were a particularly successful instance of a pattern that had been repeating since humans first reached the Americas. The Aztecs were not the first, nor the last, to inherit a world reshaped in blood, a continent where entire lineages vanished, and others endured only to carry fragments forward. Their empire was not just political, it was biological, a bridge between forgotten civilizations and the generations that followed. DNA reveals what ruins and codices cannot, migrations that defy expectation, violent replacements that erase fathers while preserving mothers, and stories written not on paper, but in our very cells. Each new discovery peels back another layer, exposing mysteries older and deeper than anyone imagined, and forcing us to ask, if such secrets lie hidden in the Americas, how many more have been buried elsewhere, waiting for us to uncover them? The story is far from over. History has left traces in our blood, in the earth, and in the shadows of what we thought we knew. And the question is whether we are ready to face what it truly says.